Professor Vishwavallabh is also here. Good evening, sir. It's a pleasure to have you. We'll be commencing with the session in another 5 minutes. And as we get closer to the moment the session starts, I request everybody to please turn your videos on.
Hi, very good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible and you're visible. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. So with your permission, I think in about a minute, as soon as it strikes 7, we'll get started.
Sure. So what's just a quick, so 1 hour session, and of that, how much for Q&A and?
Sir, so generally we can keep about maybe 20 minutes for Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll try and see if I can finish it in about 35 minutes.
Sure,
and then we can have more time for questions.
Sure. So now, as the clock strikes 7, it is my extreme and immense pleasure to welcome, on behalf of XLRI XPGDM, a very special speaker. Today we have the honor of receiving Dr. K.V. Subramanian, the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Dr. Subramanian is a leading expert on economic policy, banking, and corporate governance with a PhD from the Booth School in Chicago and alumni status from top-ranking IITs and IIMs. Dr. Subramanian authored the path-breaking economic survey that commends ethical wealth creation for a prestigious India, as well as the 2019 economic survey that lays out the strategic blueprint for India to become a $5 trillion economy. Sir, as someone who has eagerly awaited every year for the economic survey's release, I can actually understand the economic roadmap of India. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you on behalf of XLRI's XPGDM batch. Pleasure to have you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you very much. A very good evening to everyone. And let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to share my thoughts. I remember XLRI when I was at IIM Calcutta. We used to visit XLRI for the XLIMC meet, and so I have good memories of XLRI. It's good to be there interacting with all of you. Of course, I think this may be the XLIMC meet is held, I think, with the PGDM students, but I'm sure you all would have also known about it. So I'm going to talk on some of the key ideas that have underlied the enormous reforms push that has been given to the Indian economy over the last couple of years. Let me first start out by mentioning that the current economic situation that India has faced and the entire world has faced is because of the extraordinary pandemic. You know, once in a 100-year event. The last pandemic of this sort was in 1918, the Spanish flu pandemic. If those of you who follow other international agencies, the reports that they put out, last year, the International Monetary Fund, in assessing the potential impact of the pandemic, had mentioned that for the first time in 150 years, the number of countries that will have a decline in GDP, will be the largest this year. So once in a 1.5 century, kind of event. And I think that is something that we have to keep in mind. The Second aspect that I must actually mention, why across the globe, not only in India but across the globe, why there has been a significant decline. There's been a global recession. In fact, India is among the select few countries where we had 2 consecutive quarters of positive growth, Q3 and Q4. Q3 we had a marginal positive, and Q4 we had 1.6% growth. But for both Q3 and Q4, as I've actually mentioned it in my press conferences and in my other media interactions, for both the third quarter and the fourth quarter, it is better to look at the change in the gross value added rather than the GDP, change in GDP, because as I'm sure you've learned in your macroeconomics classes, GDP is equal to GVA or gross value added plus taxes minus subsidies. And when subsidies are much higher, then GDP is significantly lower, and that is what has happened. For primarily 2 reasons. One, because it was a pandemic year, the subsidies were increased significantly, and most of those subsidies have been recorded in the third and fourth quarter. They were not accounted for in the first 2 quarters, and that is why there's a significant wedge between the GDP change and the GVA change. GVA change in the third quarter was 1.6%, and in the fourth quarter was 3.7%. So as in over the last year or more than a year after COVID started, the Ministry of Finance has started coming up with what we've called the monthly economic report, where we actually give a very exhaustive, fact-based assessment of the economy. There we actually had shown that India is among a select group of very few countries that has had 2 consecutive quarters of growth during the pandemic. So that is, I think, the global situation that you must understand. Let me come back to actually what I was mentioning. Why is it that globally, despite the possibility of use of fiscal policy, monetary policy, etc., why there has been a decline in GDP across so many nations? The International Labor Organization also has estimated that almost 350 million, so that's 35 crore, 350 million, which is actually the same as the population of the United States. That's the number of people who will be impacted, in terms of the employment. The International Labor Organization looks at primarily labor markets, and they've estimated that 350 million people will be impacted. Their employment will be impacted because of the pandemic. So the question to ask, and this is something which analytically you should understand, why is it that there has been such a huge impact on the the world economy? First, to understand that, and this is what I actually will try to illustrate, to take theory to the real world. So let's go back to the GDP identity that I'm sure all of you would have learned again in your macroeconomics classes. If you take y is equal to C plus I plus G plus the net exports, which is X minus M. I hope all of you remember. And by the way, this is that, you should actually pay very careful attention to the theory that is taught in your classes, because as you can see, it really helps in careful thinking. So let's go back to that identity. GDP, Y is equal to C, which is consumption, plus I, which is investment, plus G, that's government spending, and net exports. Now let's take India, and this pattern will actually be more or less true for most other economies. If you take just consumption accounts for almost 58% of GDP. So if you take that ratio, Y, you split Y into C, I, G, and net exports. The contribution of consumption is almost 60%, and investment is another close to 30% for India. So consumption plus investment together account for 90% of GDP. Net exports is a very small number. So we can sort of, for the purpose of understanding, we can ignore that. Because more or less, in fact, if anything, in the Indian case, actually imports are greater than exports. So because we run a trade deficit. So let's just focus on C, I, and G. So C and I together account for 90% of the contribution to GDP. Government spending therefore accounts for only about 10% of overall contribution to GDP. Now, this actually, do the arithmetic in your head. If let's say there's a 1% decline, there's a 1% decline in the C and the I that contributes to 90% of the GDP. In order to offset that 1%, the government spending will have to actually grow by almost, by 90 basis points. So, which is, in other words, almost a 90% increase. So, in order to compensate the impact of the pandemic on C and I, unless government spending increases 9 times, 90% actually, for every percentage change in C and I, you actually have to see that there has to be a 9 times increase in government spending in order to just keep GDP from not declining, just ensuring that GDP stays at the same level. If there's a 1% decline in C and I, the G will have to actually grow by 9%. And that just the fiscal arithmetic, that means just imagine the amount of fiscal deficit and the impact on debt to GDP ratio, the macro finances that it creates. So that is why across the world, because G is a relatively smaller contributor to GDP compared to consumption and investment, across the board there has been a recession because C and I have declined significantly. While countries, there are many countries have actually come up with fiscal support by increasing G, but that has not been enough in offsetting the decline due to C and I. And I think this is the most important point that all of you must understand. First up, as MBA students, as those that actually are taught macroeconomics, you have to keep the basic arithmetic of a macroeconomy in mind. So the 90% of the contribution to GDP comes from the private sector, about 10% from the government. So if there is a decline of 1%, in the contribution of the private sector, in order to offset that, there has to be a 9 times increase in the contribution of the government sector, which then will create significant impact on fiscal deficit, and your debt to GDP ratio, etc. Now, even if you account for some of the multiplier effects, and I'm sure you've learned this as well, that fiscal spending by the government actually creates a multiplier effect. So there are differences in the multipliers, revenue spending versus capital spending. If you do revenue spending, which is basically just give out, it's a transfer. For instance, if you give a subsidy, or let's say you do a tax cut, for instance, mostly revenue spending. Then what happens is, in the Indian context, and research shows that if government actually does revenue expenditure of 100 rupees to the economy, only 98 rupees get added. In other words, dead weight costs are 2 rupees. Again, this is a term I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So I'm not going to I'm going to use technical terms that I expect you all to be familiar with. If you're not, then please go and revise this. As senior professionals, you need to understand macroeconomics really well. So dead weight cost is 2 rupees when government does revenue spending of 100 rupees. And that is why, only 98 rupees gets added to the economy when revenue expenditure increases by 100 rupees. In contrast, if government increases the capital expenditure by 100 rupees, so the same G component, of the GDP, that can be done through, it can be increased through revenue spending or capex spending. If the government does, does capital expenditure spending, in other words, invest in infrastructure, creates assets, if it does asset creation, then not only in India but across the world this happens. That in India the numbers are as follows: In the year when the government does the spending of 100 rupees on capital expenditure, 250 rupees gets added to the economy. So the multiplier actually is 2.5. But infrastructure that is created, actually it is created not just that year, but created over, it has its impact, over the long run. Over the entire duration of that infrastructure, the use of the infrastructure, the multiplier impact is 4.5. And I think this is another important aspect that you must keep in mind. Firstly, given the 90% contribution of C and I, government spending cannot offset the decline because of the pandemic, or on C and I. Secondly, when government support, between revenue spending and capital spending, it is actually far better to do capital spending rather than revenue spending. And that is because the multiplier impact is much higher. So as I said, actually revenue spending creates a dead weight, a loss of 2%, while capex spending creates actually a multiplier of 2.5 in the same year and 4.5 over the entire duration. Now think about it. If you actually, as MBA students, you were to invest your own money, will you invest in an avenue where you invest 100 rupees and get 98 rupees? Is that what you will do? Or you will invest where 100 rupees gives you 250 rupees in that same year, and over the next few years, gives you another 200 rupees, totally accumulating 450. I think that's a no-brainer. You will invest in the avenue where there is where you get 450 rupees rather than 250 and 200. And by the way, pay attention. Many of you will have questions saying, why isn't there a tax cut that has been done? Why hasn't been that? Why haven't we done more cash transfers, etc.? I am answering those questions through these actually. So please pay careful attention to the conceptual parts that I'm talking about. Revenue spending, which is cash transfers, tax cuts, etc. Revenue spending, while asset creation through infrastructure, construction activity, those are capex spending. And as you can see, that the impact is much higher with capex spending than revenue spending. So I think this is really important for you to keep in mind, the macroeconomics in terms of, and that now actually this sets the stage for me to talk about actually what are the reforms that we've done. But before that, let me just talk about one bit, which is the V-shaped recovery that has happened in the economy, in the macroeconomic indicators. I urge you to go and take a look. Those of you who are interested or who may actually want to learn more, take a look at the monthly economic report that has been published for the month of May. So it's been put up a few days back on the Ministry of Finance website. You can go and read about the V-shaped recovery. There evidence for that. I will not have time to go through the details, but I'll give you the big picture. So after declining by 24.4% in the first quarter, and those of you who track some of my press conferences or media interactions would remember I had mentioned that there is a V-shaped recovery that is on. And that actually has been exemplified in the fact that the second quarter, the decline was 7.5%. So from 24.4%, it actually was 7.5%, and then 0.4% and 1.6%. But as I said, it's better to use the GVA change, which is 1.6% and 3.7% as the number. So that actually, as you can see, clearly looks like a V. So there has been a V-shaped recovery, and that is illustrative of the resilience of the Indian economy. Of course, there are people, and some of you will have questions saying, oh, is it a V-shaped recovery or is it a K-shaped recovery? Of course, if you actually open the hood and start seeing differences between small firms versus large firms, SMEs versus others, some of the poor versus the rich, etc., there are differences. And I think if anything, this year, the pandemic year, is actually the best illustration of why growth is most important for India. Because and many of you would have heard, oh, the inequalities have increased. So and a year where there has been a decline of 7.3%, has exacerbated inequalities, which means, given that decline, the rich have not been impacted as much as poor have been impacted. I think that is a brilliant illustration of the fact that economic growth is so important, because economic growth actually benefits the poor far more. And I think and those of you who are interested actually can go and read the chapter that we wrote on growth versus inequality, is conflict or convergence in this year's economic survey, where we made this point that India must focus on economic growth, because the benefits that come from that, by increasing the pie, can be used for welfare spending, whether it's actually the Garib Kalyan Yojana or PM Awas Yojana, or let's say Ayushman Bharat, or any of those. The money that is generated through growth is what gets used for welfare spending, and therefore India must continue focusing on growth. So now let me actually talk about the reform. So as I've mentioned, that capital spending is incredibly important for economic growth. And as I've just said, growth itself is important even to reduce inequalities, etc., in the country, because it is lower growth that actually, or declining growth that really exacerbates inequalities, and therefore growth is really important. So now let's talk about the reforms, and let me before that just spend a minute on laying out the vision for how I think about the vision for economic development in India. A developing country like ours must focus on economic development through three pillars. Think about it as a tripod with three pillars. The first pillar of that is the combination of an exclusive focus on economic growth at the macro level, combined with efficient welfare at the micro level. So macro focus on growth plus micro focus on welfare programs together. And this is related to what I just mentioned, that when you have growth generates the resources that can be used for doing welfare programs. And therefore, I think that clarity of objective is very important. At the macro level, just focus on growth, use the resources to do welfare spending, which can reduce your inequality, which can actually help a lot of people at the poor. So do not confuse these, do not create conflicting objectives. Let the macroeconomics be focused only on economic growth, higher growth, and the micro on welfare programs. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is enable the private sector, focus on thinking about wealth and wealth creation as boons rather than as bane. 50, 60 years of socialist, of the socialist era has created this mindset where wealth and wealth creation is often thought of as actually a necessary evil. That is not actually what is right. I think across the world, and if you look, India itself, India's own history demonstrates that wealth and wealth creation are a focus on that is something that is really enables the country. And evidence for this we provided in the 2020 economic survey focused on ethical wealth creation. The first thing we showed there was up until 1750 AD, India accounted for more than 1/3 of the world's GDP, and that was because our policies then were ones that actually enabled trade, more economic activity, not socialism. Socialism, if anything, was a Western import that actually destroyed, and did not generate growth at all. It only distributed poverty rather than distributing prosperity across the country. So the second pillar has to be focused on wealth and wealth creation, enabling of the private sector, privatization, so that the government is not in the business of doing business, restricts its influence to only a few strategic sectors. And the final part, which is actually related to what I spoke about capital expenditure, is focusing on the virtuous cycle. And this is something that we covered in the 2018-19 economic survey. which basically, for that, what we did, we laid out the path for India to become the $5 trillion economy by exploiting this virtuous cycle that starts from private investment. When there is private investment, that creates growth. Growth puts money in the hands of people because employment increases, jobs get created, and wages and salaries increase. When people have more money in their hands, they go and spend that. So in the first round effects, consumption increases because of an increase in investment and then increase on growth. Consumption goes up, and anticipating that consumption, then firms invest even more. And that is how this virtuous cycle proceeds. And that is something which is very important. The private investment is at the heart of this virtuous cycle, and which I actually focused on earlier as well, talking about revenue spending versus capital spending. So this is the vision that that India has to pursue for it to become really well developed, being able to grow at 8% plus growth rates, which as I'm going to talk about in the reforms, and then I'll summarize by saying that India definitely has the ability to grow at 8% in a couple of years from now. So what are the reforms that we have done over the last couple of years, illustrating this vision, or really articulating this vision? What are the reforms that we've done? So the first thing is we have focused on removing a lot of the supply side frictions that hobble the economy. So, when you look at an advanced economy and contrast that to a developing economy like India, the big difference is emerging economies, developing economies like ours suffer from a lot of frictions on the supply side. These are created by unnecessary regulation, enormous regulation, which actually which inhibits private activity. It is in the form of very, very stringent labor laws, which does not enable job creation in the economy. It is in the form of many other forms of regulation. Too much presence of the government in business. All these are aspects that you will see in most emerging economies. You do not see this in the advanced economies. So the first thing is the emphasis on reducing these supply side frictions. And what have we done in that area? First, and possibly the most important, is the enterprise policy focused on enabling the private sector. So last year, around this time, when the Atmanirbhar Bharat package was announced, one of the key announcements in that was the enterprise policy that is focused on enabling the private sector. The government made the explicit announcement that save for a couple of sectors, 3 or 4 sectors, which government will remain, in business, because those are strategic sectors. Every other sector, government will get out of business, and that basically lays the agenda for privatization. And you would have seen in the budget as well, therefore, the announcement of privatization of 2 public sector banks, of the announcement of LIC's IPO, a huge and prior announcements of privatization of Air India, BPCL, etc. So this is just the start of this year. The target is 1,70,000 crores from privatization, but this will just be the start, of the unwinding of the public sector, and thereby enhancing efficiency. So that is one of the key areas. And here the announcement of privatization of public sector banks is extremely critical, because the public sector banks are sort of the bellwether of the socialist era, and starting to unwind that is, I think, a very important aspect in implementing this enterprise policy focused on the private sector. The reason the private sector works very well is 2 things, and I'm sure you've again learned this as well in your economics classes: incentives and information. Both of which, incentives are far more powerful in the private sector, and information is also information asymmetry is lower, and that is why world over you see that the private sector, the efficiencies are better on average. And last year's economic survey 2020, we had written a chapter titled Privatization and Wealth Creation, where we provided a plethora of evidence of how privatization enables wealth creation for the economy. So that's one of most important reforms that have been done. The second really important reforms is on the on the labor codes, core labor codes, reform the entire labor regulation, and second, these are very important because these are factor inputs. You have agriculture is provides factor inputs of raw material, while labor is another factor input that goes into production. And typically, the political economy of reform of factor markets is far harder. It's far harder to do than reforming product markets, which was what was done in 1991, and then during the Atal Bihari Vajpayee regime as well. So those two reforms are really critical because now about 40 odd labor laws that were there at the central level have been condensed into just 4 codes. The number of sections that actually govern the labor relationship have been reduced by 2/3. So only 1/3 of the sections. There's been greater protection provided, more social security for employees, for gig workers as well. Workers in the gig economy. The compliance burden has been reduced significantly. The number of minimum wages that were there, if India before this, before these regulations had close to 2,300 minimum wages. Can you imagine 2,300 minimum wages? And those have been brought down to just 40 now. So, orders of magnitude decline from 2,300 to 40. So, the other thing that has happened is a lot of the thresholds have been increased. So, for a firm to be, to actually have to comply with standing orders on the labor laws, the threshold has been increased from 100 employees to 300 employees. The definition of factory has been increased from 20 employees to 50 employees, and all these are intended to enable economies of scale, significant increases in economies of scale. That's the first labor reforms. Agricultural reforms, very important, because this is one area where for 70 years there has been very little investment. Agriculture has not seen investment at all, because this is one area where markets have just been completely dysfunctional, with the small and marginal farmer being totally beholden to the intermediary, someone whom we call arhatya, in Hindi. So that reform is very important, because it will really enable, and it will provide opportunities to the small and marginal farmer to be able to go and sell his or her produce to someone else. And this is one of the key aspects to any market transaction, which is, if I, as the seller, I have the opportunity to be able to sell to 2 people, then I can actually tell, and it could be the arhatya, it could also be, let's say, a corporate that I'm selling to. I can tell the arhatya, if he doesn't give me a good price, I can tell him, मैंने नहीं बेचना है आपको, एक्चुअली आप मुझे सही पैसे नहीं दे रहे हो, मैं जाके किसी और को बेचूंगा, आप यदि सही पैसे and marginal farmer has not had so far in 70 years, and that is something that is very important. Therefore, the second, which is agricultural reforms, which can really help in really enabling the welfare of the small and marginal farmers, and thereby really increase productivity in the agricultural sector. So labor reforms, agricultural reforms, before that the enterprise policy, then the change in the MSME definitions. One of the problems on the supply side that India has faced is that most firms remain really small. They do not grow at all. The reason they do not grow is I'll give you a parallel. I think many of us actually, when we might have learned to bicycle first, we may have had those training wheels. Have you seen those bicycles with training wheels? You have so when a kid is learning to bicycle, the kid is given those training wheels so that the kid does not fall when he or she is learning to bicycle. But when the parent actually puts those training wheels, the idea is very clear that the training wheels are temporary. they are going to be removed once the kid learns to bicycle. But if suppose, let's say you told the kid that, hey son or hey daughter, you can keep these training wheels forever. If the training wheels are there forever, then the kid will not have the incentive to really learn to be able to bike, on his or her own. And I think this is the problem that has hobbled Indian policy, especially with SMEs, which is that we basically have, by continuing to provide, provide them protection, irrespective of whether they are a 5-year-old firm or a 100-year-old firm, we basically not enable them to grow at all. It is as if, let's say, your parents had told you that even when you're 40-year-old, we will support you, then you may have never had enough incentive to go and become independent, get a job for yourself. So we've thereby created dwarfs among our SMEs, which is dwarfs firms that have grown older but continue to be small. The reason we actually, have these policies focused on SMEs, and that's why I gave you the example of the training wheel, is that when the firm is basically still catching, is growing and learning how to compete with others, I think some support is absolutely important. Support should be provided, but that support should never be permanent. If the support is permanent, then the firm has no incentive to grow out of that. And this phenomenon of dwarfism, therefore, has been really a problem in the Indian economy, because these dwarfs do not avail economies of scale. Because they do not avail economies of scale, their costs remain very high. Because their costs are very high, they have to charge a higher price. So they are not competitive. Therefore, in world markets, they're not able to go and export and compete with firms from, from other countries in the. So this is one of the key problems. And the change in the MSME definitions has been intended to enable economies of scale. Similarly, if you look at the production-linked incentive scheme for fostering exports, that is also a scheme where there is explicit incentive for the firm to grow. So if you continue to be the same size, the incentive will be removed. But in order to be able to avail these incentives, the firm has to continue growing. And this is important, because when an SME grows, the biggest benefit that comes is to the promoter. Imagine, having a firm that has, let's say, a 10 crore turnover versus a firm that has a 100 crore turnover. A firm that has a 100 crore turnover, the promoter is the one that actually makes the most benefits. But in the process, the promoter also creates more employment, because you can imagine that a 100 crore firm will have far more employees, will hire far more employees than a 10 crore firm. So the promoter does good for himself, but also serves the nation in producing far more jobs. That's the other set of reforms: the MSME definitional changes, the production-linked incentives, and finally on the financial sector. Financial sector, and capital is another really key input, which is another key factor input, because as you remember, again, you must have learned in your economics classes, labor and capital are two most important inputs. So apart from reforming labor, and the enterprise policy and raw material inputs through agriculture, capital also has been reformed, and that is through the privatization of the public sector banks, the creation of the bad bank so that bad assets can be taken from the the existing balance sheets, and thereby enable banks to lend. There is a development financial institution in the public sector has been created for infrastructure financing, so that the emphasis on infrastructure, the financing for that can come. Also, that legislation enables private sector DFIs to be created, and development financial institutions in the private sector, so that infrastructure financing can happen. And finally, the insurance sector as well, increase in the FDI limit up to 74%, and the IPO of LIC, because once LIC lists, that will really bring in better governance and will from shareholder ownership, and that will also help the insurance sector. So let me now summarize in terms of the reforms push. As I said, in order for India to grow, India's model for development has to be based on three pillars. The first one is an exclusive focus on the macroeconomy, on growth, on the macroeconomic side, on just growth, growing the pie, economic growth, combined with efficient welfare at the micro level. That's the first pillar. The second pillar is enabling the private sector, and thinking about wealth and wealth creation thereby as boons and not as necessary evil. And the final one is virtuous cycle starting from private investment. So all the reforms that have been done, therefore, are basically articulating this vision, using the three pillars. The enterprise policy focused on enabling the private sector and government withdrawing. The factor market reforms in agriculture, labor, the capital, which is your financial sector, and also on small and medium firms, to enable them to grow. So these are all actually aspects of implementing that vision of the three pillars. Let me conclude by saying what will be the impact of this on economic growth. So if you take the macroeconomic identity, that economic growth is equal to the investment rate in the country times the productivity in the country. So investment rate times productivity. In other words, keeping productivity the same, if investment rate goes up, then growth rate goes up. Similarly, keeping the investment rate the same, if productivity goes up, then again growth rate goes up. Now, these reforms that I've just talked about will increase both the investment rate in the country and also productivity in the country. Which are the set of reforms that will increase productivity? The first and the foremost is the enterprise policy focused on private sector. Privatization, together with the production-linked incentive schemes focused on growth, enabling economies of scale, and also the MSME definitional changes to enable economies of scale. All these will have impact on increasing productivity. At the same time, the infrastructure spending by the government, will crowd in private investment, and also the labor reforms and the agricultural reforms. All of those will have the effect of increasing the investment rate in the economy. In fact, already this has happened in the fourth quarter of the financial year that went by. The gross fixed capital formation to GDP, the ratio of gross fixed capital formation to GDP, which is basically a proxy for investment, was a 24-quarter high. So, just get that number correct. It was the highest in the last 24 quarters, which means in the last 6 years. At 34% of GDP. So the impact on investment is already starting to happen. Similarly, on manufacturing side as well, because we have emphasized on manufacturing through the production-linked incentives, through the labor market reforms, and the MSMEs, the definitional changes. So all of these will increase investment rate and will also enhance productivity. So when you have both increasing, the GDP growth rate should increase as well. So my estimation, starting from FY24 onwards, because some of these. So from FY24 onwards, it's quite likely that we should start growing at 7% plus. And this decade, mark my words, this decade will be the decade of India's growth, where India will grow at the highest rate, among all the large economies. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. I think we have about 20 minutes for questions.
All those who have questions, can you please, we have a few raised hands. Sarvesh, you want to take it?
Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you, Ayush. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the insightful talk. I'm sure each one of us is going to take a handful of positive insights today, along with the three pillars you shared for the economic growth. Now, I welcome you to the interactive part of the session. The students who are willing to ask questions will raise their hands, and I'll connect to you one by one. Now, I request the interested participants to raise their hands. And we'll start with Ankita Singh. Over to you, Ankita.
Good evening, sir. Sir, I have a question. So it is, what do you think about the universal basic free income being given as a DBT would have on our economy? especially now that the consumption needs have revamped post-COVID. So how is that going to affect?
It's an impractical idea. A lot of countries, particularly some of the Scandinavian countries, have tried it. I think if you notice also, when free cash is provided, that has a dampening impact on incentives to work. One of the key aspects, actually, which is, the reason I say it's an impractical idea is the universal basic income is predicated on the idea that all other subsidies will be taken out, and the UBI will actually substitute for all other subsidies. Now, taking out all other subsidies is a big if, because if you have and go back and read the economic survey chapter on UBI, this is the most important aspect, that you can't have a situation where the existing subsidies continue as they are and then you actually latch on UBI on top of it. So if you don't have the existing subsidies being removed, then UBI cannot work. But actually, given the I don't think oftentimes the understanding of this is there, which is that it's a substitute for all the other subsidies, and that being able to remove is a big if. At the same time, also actually the impact on the incentives to work is also an important aspect that must be kept in mind. I'm not a big fan of it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir, for your answer.
Next, we have Niharika Jain.
Hi, sir. Very good evening for your immensely precious time, taking out time for us. My question to you is, sir, our recent economic survey has suggested that India, despite being, fifth largest economy, has been rated
Sorry,
in...
Niharika.
Yeah, hello? Hello? Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, now you're audible.
Okay. Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. Sir, my question to you is that India, being the fifth largest economy, from the economic survey, we have seen that it has been in the lowest rung of the economic grade. Why is India's credit rating so low, and how can the issues be addressed?
It's a good question, Niharika. So as we showed, in that chapter, the models for the models that these credit rating agencies use, and I'm saying models within quotes because to distinguish it from other. So when you look at models for credit ratings of firms, companies. For instance, let's say, a particular company is, let's say, rated AAA, another firm is, let's say, rated, AA or so. If you take the ratings and correlate it with, for instance, the default history, what you'll find, you can go and actually check this out. You can go to Moody's website or S&P's website, find out the historical probabilities of default. You'll find a very strong correlation between the rating and the probability of default. Now, that is for corporates, and this is for corporates across the world. Try and do the same exercise across countries, and we've shown this in the economic survey chapter. The correlation between default and sovereign default and sovereign credit ratings is very nebulous, almost non-existent. And I think eventually credit rating is just a mapping of the of basically the probability of default. So a AAA means a certain probability of default, a AA means another probability of default, and so on. This particular mapping does not happen. So there are some fundamental issues in the credit rating models. Let me illustrate further. One of the key parameters that these rating agencies use, in these sovereign ratings models, is GDP per capita instead of actual GDP. Now, what is the conceptual flaw in this? There's a big conceptual flaw here. If suppose a country borrows, let's say, a certain amount, and just to give you an illustration, let's say in the context of corporations, it's as if, I do not look at the, the actual, so it takes the company takes on a certain amount of debt and it has total assets. So it's as if in order to repay that debt, I do not look at the total, assets of the company. I look at the assets per shareholder. So, you get the parallel. Now, if a country has borrowed money, it is the entire GDP of that, which is basically the output that is produced in that year. That is what will be used to repay the debt. But GDP is not as big a measure. The reason GDP per capita actually, was has been such an important measure is because historically, if you look at over the last 50 odd, years, it's the advanced economies, most of them in the West, that actually had the highest ratings. And so, in order to justify that, they had to give a high weight to GDP per capita because it was these countries that had the highest GDP per capita. But after the global financial crisis, there are many countries, many of these advanced economies in the West, which have had actually significant slides in their credit ratings. Countries like Greece, for instance, Greece, Ireland, and others have actually been on the brink of default, sovereign default. And yet these rating agencies continue using GDP per capita as an important measure instead of GDP. They do not basically take into account something as important as whether a country has defaulted or not. Because when you look at default itself is a function of two things: the ability to repay and the willingness to repay. The ability to repay is captured by GDP, not GDP per capita. So there's a conceptual flaw there. The willingness to repay is captured by whether or not that country has defaulted before. India has never ever defaulted before across political dispensations. And because this is not unlike Latin American countries which have defaulted several times, India has never defaulted because whether to repay or not our debt, that's not an economic decision for us. It is a philosophical, spiritual decision in some sense, right? Moral decision, ethical decision, because no government ever basically has approved of this. Even in 1991, when we were facing the worst balance of payments crisis ever in our history, we actually shipped gold to the Bank of England to honor our obligations. That is basically our willingness to repay. And yet this is also not captured. So the ability to repay is not captured very well. Willingness to repay is not captured very well. So all the conceptual things that I would teach in a class gets factored in the sovereign ratings methodology. So are you surprised then that the kind of ratings that gets thrown up is actually all over the place?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Now, a senior XLRI faculty, Professor Vishwa Ballab, would like to ask you a question. Over to you, sir.
Vallabh sir, you're on mute.
Can't hear.
Vallabh sir.
Vallabh sir,
Not able to see either.
Yeah, I think.
You're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Professor
Yeah, go ahead.
Subramanian. Okay. Thank you, Professor Subramanian, for introducing macroeconomics course. These are our first year students and they are just going through this first course in economics, managerial economics. And your introduction to the macroeconomics and various perspective, etc., will certainly help us in the debate in the next term for these people. You have very rightly emphasized and explained that the overall challenges of Indian economy and also the perspective that how the India should go ahead. I have, so that part you have explained also. And if you look to, if I examine for last 4, 5, 6 years of budget, one of the concern of this particular government, has been that to keep the macro fundamental as a right and do not get trapped into that GDP and fiscal deficit and other things and like that. However, you must be reading and you are maybe aware that there are a lot of concern. People are saying that the government, because of these concerns, macroeconomic fundamental, there is a little bit of conservative in this very special kind pandemic, very severe crisis we are encountering. So therefore, people expect bit that the more push is required. So that is, of course, the debate keep on going. But more fundamental is this. If you look to the, I think in first time in 2007, the GDP to employment ratio, that's employment elasticity with respect to GDP, has declined in India from 0.4 to 0.2. This means if you have to achieve 1% growth, earlier 2.5%, 1% employment, 2.5% growth was sufficient. Now, because it has declined, this employment elasticity, so you need to have 1% employment, you need to have 5% growth rate. So where from this? So this means if you have to increase 2 or 3%, let us say employment, you should have 10% growth rate in our Indian economy. So how can we achieve this? My second point is that you have very rightly emphasized and you have given good perspective. I have very close, I have read very carefully the economic survey prepared by you. Microeconomics, of course, has emphasized that it should be growth. It should focus on growth. Micro part should focus on the welfare part of. But micro part, when you take, then it comes to leadership at a local level, like panchayat, state, and other things and like that. And therefore, there are lot of, I would say, there will be a constraining kind of situation. And my third question to you would be, whatever you can, if you can highlight, that people are still expecting that you have explained that because the you 2.5% multiplier with respect to investment, but there is a lot of gestation. Lot of gestation period, etc. So in this kind of pandemic period, what will be that kind of investment which can give us quick result? So that's an important part, because otherwise the economy will keep on. 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, whatever you are explaining, I can understand that. But what about immediate impact on the economy, because we are already here? So that where should we focus our investment so that the economy spin off quickly? These are some of the questions. And once again, I would like to thank you for in very simple manner and a very subtle way you have explained, and I hope that we will have good debate in macroeconomics class, given your this particular very nice introduction of this course you have given. So first session is over for that particular course. Thank you very much. If you can.
Thank you, Professor Vallabh. I think I may have difficulty keeping all the questions that you've asked. Let me try and answer. So the first, let me clarify. See, the impact of investment is, that's not going to be felt after 5 years or 10 years. As I was mentioning, again, let me reiterate this, right? If 100 rupees is invested in capital expenditure this year, just this year itself, 250 rupees gets added to the economy. This is an NIPFP paper, and similarly, Ashima Goel and others actually at IGIDR have also done similar work. So in that same year, 2.5 times multiple gets created in the same year, number one. The over the remaining maybe 2-3 years, another 200 rupees, so 4.5 gets added. So the first thing is actually that you don't have to wait for 4-5 years for the impact of of infrastructure to be felt. And let me give you the evidence of this just from the fourth quarter itself. I don't know whether you actually whether you tracked the GDP numbers that came out in the fourth quarter. So government actually increased its spending significantly on infrastructure in the fourth quarter. This was part of the part of the emphasis on infrastructure spending. Because of the increase in infrastructure spending, construction sector grew by 15% in the fourth quarter. So infrastructure spending by the government led to a 15% increase in construction activity. What was the impact of this? What was the positive spillover? Two key areas. One, consumption, which had actually declined for 3 consecutive quarters, grew at 2.7% in the fourth quarter, in that quarter itself, by 2.7%. Second, the contact sensitive sector, this is service sector. So government has invested in infrastructure, and construction activity has increased. But as construction activity increases, a lot of the other sectors also get impacted. So, these contact sensitive sectors like travel, tourism, etc., which had declined at double digits, high double digits in the previous 3 quarters, declined only 2.3% in the fourth quarter. So as you can see, what I've told you as the evidence of the multiplier 2.5 in that same year, the fourth quarter evidence, fourth quarter's phenomenon is also illustrative of the same thing. Why? Because construction sector is by far the most important. That is why we are emphasizing infrastructure spending, because infrastructure creation requires construction activity, and construction activity creates a lot of jobs in the informal sector, especially people, urban poor, for instance, work a lot in the construction sector. And the informal, economy is very important for India, because, a lot of people work in the informal sector. So I think that's the answer to your, to us, I think 1 or 2 questions here. Why is it that we are focusing on infrastructure and not as much on just giving cash transfers or, let's say, tax breaks, etc.? Because of this. At the same time, let me also tell you, over the last 1 year, the emergency credit scheme that we have implemented, which is, by the way, has been by far the most successful among all the schemes, the ECGLS, emergency credit to small and medium enterprises, plus other schemes together. Actually, one of the key ways in which spending has been done is, free food for almost 400 million people. And over the entire of almost 8 months of last year, and that has been extended now for for this year as well, up until Diwali. So which actually has been a huge amount. And now you understand this difference. A lot of people look at cash transfers done by advanced economies and say India must do cash transfers, without understanding that advanced economies do not have a public distribution system like we do. So in order to provide for for the poor to be able to even buy food, they have to do cash transfers, because they don't have a PDS. We have a PDS, and we have actually therefore given essential items, and which actually is better than giving cash, because that gets actually consumed, right? Cash could possibly be spent on other things as well. So while we have done less cash transfers than advanced economies, we have used the public distribution system to provide for a lot of the. Similarly, the PM Kisan cash transfers also were provided early itself, and widows and others actually, and vulnerable sections have been given cash transfers as well. So I think it is important to understand the nuances here. So to summarize, in terms of the response, number one, we have focused on providing essentials in kind, number one. Number two, we've actually apart from that, we've actually focused on capital expenditure spending, especially encouraging construction activity, so that urban poor, because the pandemic has impacted the urban areas far more than rural areas. Also in rural areas, Manrega actually works as the MNREGS works, as a conduit for distressed employment. You don't have that in urban areas, and having an MNREGS kind of program in urban areas actually does not work. In fact, there's a symposium that Ideas for India had organized on John Drees' plan for for a similar program, where there were a lot of problems that were highlighted, because rural sector Manrega works well because it is seasonal employment because of agriculture. At the same time, also what happens is, firstly, in urban areas, employment is not seasonal, number one. Number two, there are significant differences in skill levels across, in urban areas compared to rural areas. And third, because urban areas cost of living is higher than rural areas, if you have to do a Manrega kind of program in urban areas, you have to keep the wage levels higher in urban areas than rural areas, which will then create migration from rural areas onto urban areas and will exacerbate the problems in urban areas. Because rural to urban migration is a problem. So if you have this, it will only exacerbate the problem. So there are lots of practical problems with these conceptual and practical problems. So to summarize, in terms of the response, essentials have been focused on, especially food through the PDS. Cash transfers have been given to vulnerable sections, and the focus has been on infrastructure spending, construction activity for the urban poor. I think I've covered most of your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Prabhu. Thank you.
Maybe there might have been one or two I might have missed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. With due respect, would you be willing to take a couple of questions more?
Yeah, I think we can take a couple of more questions.
Okay, I'll ask Apurva Mehta to continue with the question.
Good evening, sir. So one thing I remember reading in the economy survey was about the JAM Trinity, Jan Dhan, Aadhaar and mobile. Is this scheme still a central pillar of the direct benefit scheme, particularly today when social security is such a crucial importance?
Yeah, absolutely, very much. In fact, what I spoke about efficient welfare. Efficient welfare has really been delivered through the use of the JAM Trinity. The cash transfers, for instance, are being done directly into the Jan Dhan accounts, and these are Aadhaar authenticated. And basically, mobile phones are being JAM Trinity is a very critical part of efficient welfare. In fact, over the last 7 years, this government has actually has done welfare in a very efficient manner compared to previous government, and that is primarily because of the use of the JAM Trinity.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. I would request KP Aditya Rao to go with the next question.
Good evening, Subramanian sir. Am I audible?
Yep.
Yeah. So I just wanted to know this thing. So like you said, we have done very well in Q3. We have had a 0.4% growth GDP, and in Q4 we have had roughly 1.4%. And
Aditya, let me just quickly correct you. As I was mentioning, as business school students, who are, let's say, from what I heard from Professor Vallabh, you will be learning macro later, but there is a difference between GDP change and GVA change. As I said, for Q3 and Q4, you should be looking at the GVA change. GVA change has been 1.6% for Q3 and 3.7% for Q4. That's the right number to look at. So now go ahead.
So I'll make sure I look into it. So I just wanted to know, so now we have had a second phase of pandemic, which has impacted our country. And recently I was reading an article that Maharashtra is anticipating a pandemic at a higher level, which is the third wave which we are seeing. So how is the growth going to be impacted because of this? Because I was seeing a RBI survey which said that we are expecting a 9% GDP growth in this particular financial year. And with the third wave also coming in, this might take a big hit also. So what is the figure which we are anticipating, and what can the government actually do now?
So I had covered this in my the presentation that I did on the, following the GDP numbers, the fourth quarter GDP numbers, I think it was 29th or 30th of May, I had covered this. So we've done an estimation of the impact of the second wave. We looked at two scenarios. One scenario was where the second wave would peak by mid-May. By the way, this assessment was done early April when we were entering the second wave. So we considered two scenarios there. One was whether the second wave would peak by mid-May, and second was the second wave would peak by mid-June. As it actually transpired, the second wave peaked. In that scenario, what we estimated was that the impact on GDP growth will not be very large. There will be some impact, of course, undeniably, but will not be very large, and primarily because in this time the lockdowns, and restrictions have been heterogeneous across states, and they have actually been asynchronous as well. They've not been at the same time. For instance, if you look at in the month of April, only about 30% of the GDP was impacted. Because primarily, if you looked at states where there were restrictions, it was Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh to some extent, and Delhi in the last week, starting from 24. The month of May, a lot more impact was there. About, there were restrictions in, almost, I think 70% of GDP was sort of impacted in the month of May, but it's only for 1 month, 70% actually was impacted. So based on that, we have done an assessment. As RBI has also said, the impact will be about 1% is what RBI, mentioned. And I must tell you that, when we did our estimation for the GDP growth for this year, we actually were conservative. While IMF, Fitch, etc., had projected growth at 12.5%, 12.8%, etc., even OECD, we actually said only 11%. The budget took it as 10.5% only. As a result, we actually left some headspace, headroom as well. So I actually think that, and that's I think, in hindsight was the right thing to do. So I think, number one, I don't think the impact of the second wave will be that large. There will be impact, but not as much. Third wave, see, I have been working very closely with the, with professors at my alma mater, IIT Kanpur, professors who actually developed the Sutra model, and have also been looking at serological surveys, studies, and patterns across other countries, in terms of the second, third waves. This prediction that there will be a third wave is like a heads I win, tails you lose kind of prediction. I think you have to factor that in into the prediction, because it's like if the third wave happens, it basically heads I win because I told you so. If the third wave does not happen, then tails you lose by saying that, oh, because I had warned, that's why people took care, and therefore third wave did not happen. So that's why the the heads I win, tails you lose kind of situation. So if you look at the overall seroprevalence, and I think the serological study is being done, but I was just reading today, Delhi serological prevalence is about 70%. So 70% of the population has has antibodies. Now Delhi, I think, is not representative of other areas. It's possible other areas will have much much less seroprevalence. But I will tell you that we had estimated early April that by the end of the second wave, about 40% of the overall population of the country would have antibodies. 40%. Now, if you take, now this is 40% of the entire population. If you take the fact that urban areas are a lot more likely to have antibodies compared to the, rural areas, and also accounting for the fact that some people who may have gotten their antibodies after the first wave if they have not gotten vaccinated, it's possible their immunity may have gone down because it stays for about 6 to 8 months. The studies published in Lancet and British Medical Journal, etc., suggest that the antibodies stay from getting infected, stay for about 6 to 8 months. So taking all these factors into account, I think that anywhere between 55 to 60% of urban area, urban population may have antibodies. Now, if you start adding the vaccination as well, keeping in mind that there is some double count here because people who may have gotten the infected in the first wave would be getting vaccinated as well. So when you take that into account, it's likely we may be close to about 60% plus in terms of so I'm adding only between 5 to 10%, of the. So right now, if you look at overall, actually, we have about 22 crore people have gotten their first dose. So I think when you put these numbers together, you can start seeing that while we certainly have not reached herd immunity, I'm not going to claim that we've reached herd immunity at all, but we may be close to 60%. And I think, I do remember when the pandemic started last year, epidemiologists were saying 70% population, if it has immunity, then we will have herd immunity. That did not take into account many of the variants that have come. So if you take into account the variants and the Delta variant and the Delta plus, etc., it's possible that we may actually need to be at 80% plus, maybe 80 to 82% for herd immunity. So keeping all this into account, what you can see is unlike the second wave, when in December the antibodies were only 25% of the population had antibodies actually, and that too, I don't know whether the sample is very representative, it may actually, it's a sample anyway. So unlike the situation after the first wave, before the second wave, where the antibody prevalence was not as high and vaccination had not proceeded as much, in contrast, now a lot more proportion of people are likely to have antibodies and vaccination is proceeding. And it's possible by September, because August and September, the supply of vaccines is expected to ramp up significantly. And we can actually, as we had covered in the monthly economic report, we can do 1 crore doses a day. At our peak, we've done 42 lakh doses a day, but that we've done that with just 1 8-hour shift. If you can do 42 lakhs in 1 8-hour shift, with 24/7 for vaccination for, let's say, just 2 months, August and September, we can do 1 crore doses. So we can actually, by end of September, vaccinate a good proportion of the population. When you add the antibodies that are also prevailing because of the infection itself, it's possible that we may be close to, so therefore, I think the likelihood of a very intense third wave, let me acknowledge, I am not an epidemiological expert. I am unlike economics, where I'm a producer of research, both a consumer and a producer of research. I'm consumer of others' research, producer of my research. In epidemiology and all this, this part, I'm only a consumer of research. So, therefore, you have to discount for the fact that I am not the expert, but I've read a ton on this. Based on that, I actually can say that I think the third wave may not be that intense. But I think this is a question that must be valid, or an assessment that must be validated by the experts. Today, if you read Dr. Vinod Paul's, the advisor of Niti Aayog, for health, he's also said that kids, for instance, are unlikely to be impacted as much by the third wave. And so I think from what I hear, it is consistent with even my conversations with the IIT Kanpur professors. I think this assessment is shared by others as well, experts in this field. So overall, I think that the risks, at least to the economy from a third wave, may not be that high. But I think what is important is, and that's why vaccination is really critical, is we need to reduce the fear of the pandemic, because people will go and consume only when the fear of the pandemic goes down. And so for consumption to really to come back for full throttle, the fear of the pandemic has to go down, then vaccination becomes really critical. So I think very longish answer to what I think it was a very important question. I think in sum, I would say that the likelihood of a very intense third wave, very debilitating third wave, I think is not that high. But as I said, you should have that checked with epidemiological experts and other scientists in this field.
That answers my question, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking out so much time for us. I would now like to invite Apurva to deliver the vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I am Apurva Mehta from the XPGDM batch. I hope everyone thoroughly enjoyed this extraordinary and enriching session that we arranged for you today. It is my honor and privilege to give this vote of thanks to our honorable speaker, Dr. Subramanian. I want to start by thanking Dr. Subramanian on behalf of the entire cohort of XLRI for taking out time from his hectic schedule on a Friday evening to join us and deliver this oration on economic reforms. It comes as no surprise that this talk was seamless and delivered with panache. Sir, I thoroughly enjoyed the vast experience and anecdotes you shared with us today. I'm sure each one of us would agree that this session has been absolutely enriching, and I'm pretty sure we can imbibe the takeaways from this session to grow not only in our careers, but also as individuals. Thank you once again, sir. It has been an absolute honor to host you this evening. I would also like to thank the faculty, staff, and the entire clan of XLRI for taking out time to be here today. Thank you. Over to you, Ayush.
Thank you so much, sir, on behalf of all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Thank you, 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 sir.